The Investigators of Arkham Horror, published in 2016 by Fantasy Flight Games as a companion piece to their Cthulhu Mythos Arkham Horror Files franchise. Right off the bat, I want to be forthcoming about the fact that I have never played any of the games nor read any of the Arkham Horror Files novels. I have a vague understanding of the games in passing, but this was really my first foray into the franchise, and mentioning this is important. First, because it means this is not the most authoritative review. Out of ignorance, I may misinterpret or overlook things that are important to people who are knowledgeable about the games, which of course is who this book is really for. So if that's you and you're concerned my lack of familiarity undermines my opinions, that's totally fine. There are tons of other reviews from people way better informed than me, and I have looked at those anyway to compare and have done a bit of research, but if I do get anything wrong or miss anything, you know why, and please do correct me in the comments. But this is why I wanted to do this review anyway, in case there are people who, like myself, are unfamiliar with Fantasy Flight's games or novels, but are interested and wondering if this book is a good gateway into Arkham Horror for the uninitiated, or someone who perhaps has no interest in playing the games but is a fan of the Cthulhu mythos in general and wondering, does this book have anything to offer? And so as someone who came to this book from that perspective, I can tell you in both cases the answer is absolutely. But no matter who you are or what your past experience and knowledge, understanding exactly what the nature and function of this book is so crucial as to whether or not you're going to find this book disappointing or incredible. So the book presents 52 short stories, and by short I mean almost flash fiction length, and by stories I mean more like scenes or vignettes. Everyone will have their own opinion of what defines a story. Throughout this review I'm going to be calling them stories, but that's just so I have a way to refer to them. Even though personally I don't consider these stories, they're really like 52 first chapters of stories. They're all set up, no payoff. All questions, no answers. That may sound awful, and I think there will be people really turned off and dissatisfied by that, but this approach makes perfect sense once you understand what the book is supposed to be. Each of these 52 stories, or profiles or entries, whatever you want to call them, each of them focuses on one of the characters or investigators from the Arkham Horror Files games and novels, specifically giving their backstory, recounting an event where the character had their initial or early brush with the Eldritch forces, or what led them to Arkham to investigate these mysteries. If you're familiar with the games, it's like a longer version of the kind of flavor text you get on the cards, and so over the course of say 6 pages you'll be reading about this character, getting interested in them and their story, ooh, what's going on here, what's going to happen, and then you turn that 7th page and that's it. You're onto a new character. No resolution, no nothing. It just feels like the build-up in a first chapter or prologue and that's it. But that's the whole point of this book. That interest and engagement the story establishes is supposed to then compel you to go play as that character in one of the games, read about the character in one of the novels, all in a more exciting and invested way, and now that you're experiencing it with the background knowledge of who the character is. But what truly makes this work, makes this book enjoyable to read whether on its own or as part of the larger franchise, is the connected nature of the stories through the shared world, through references, cameos, etc. I can't overstate how important, rewarding, and enjoyable this is, and the core reason the book is successful despite what appears like a very unsatisfying structure. I find most anthologies very unsatisfying because the stories are all largely independent and unrelated except for maybe sharing a theme, and so you read the short story and then that's it. It's a tiny isolated island that isn't part of anything larger, doesn't have any larger meaning. Whereas in this book, though each story is still standalone and completely unrelated to the others plot-wise, the disappointment of not having the fulfillment of any individual story is, in my opinion, mitigated and outweighed by the fact that they're unified by this shared world. And so each story is contributing to a tapestry of Arkham that is greater than the sum of its parts, and this unification occurs in several different ways. Within the book itself, you'll have investigators or other characters who make an appearance or are referenced in other stories. Some stories take place at the same location. Sometimes if I wasn't familiar with a reference or character, I'd look it up and find it was a reference to a card in one of the games or something from the novels. And then of course the references to Lovecraft's work are abundant, both in very big, obvious ways or other times just Easter eggs. Granted, I wouldn't call any of this referencing meaningful in any sort of deep or grand plot sense. They are largely just about fun, cute Easter eggs, but even so, it's still so important to the reading experience and in how these references establish connections between these stories, games, novels, Lovecraft, that creates richer world building, engagement, and makes it so enjoyable. And so the more you've read and the more attention you pay, the greater that joy will be, because you'll be able to pick up on all this stuff and connect it all. Not being familiar with the games or novels, I'm sure there was tons of stuff that I missed, but even just within the book itself and my, what I would call basic familiarity with Lovecraft, I was still consistently being delighted with like, hey, it's that guy from the other thing. Though, while we're on this note, I should mention that the only person I'm not sure I'd recommend this book to is if you are completely ignorant of the Cthulhu mythos and are perhaps wondering if this book is a good gateway into that. I mean, you can do that. I just don't think it's the best way to enjoy the book. I think you need to have at least a very, very basic understanding of the mythos lore and style of these sort of stories, particularly because of the very abrupt and reference-heavy nature of the book. Without a basic understanding and appreciation of the larger framework to place them in, it'll be difficult to get your footing and maybe too weird and confusing. In a bad way, an unappealing way, as distinct from the intended weird and confusing bedrock of cosmic horror. Because each story is so brief and over before it begins, my initial reaction was, oh, they really should have split this into 2 volumes and made each story twice as long. But as I was rereading it for this review, I realized that really wouldn't have made much of a difference. We would have been able to linger a little longer, but I don't think that would have alleviated that feeling of being unresolved or left hanging. Because again, the point here isn't to tell a story, it's the background, the spark to ignite your interest in the character and pursue their journey outside this book. So having these stories be 2, 3, 4 times as long wouldn't fundamentally improve on what's already here, and so in that light, though they're really short and will leave you wishing there was more, I think the length is completely appropriate, wisely chosen, and used very well. As for the writing itself, it's absolutely fantastic, in my opinion anyway. I think what I like most about it is how consistent the quality of the writing is across the stories, which is another thing that really stood out as overcoming an issue present in most anthologies. That of inconsistent quality, or even just the style of different writers throwing you off, makes for a very uneven read, and why most anthologies feel like such a mixed bag. That is not the case here at all. You'll obviously like some stories better than others, of course, but the consistent high quality of the writing means the distance between the peaks and troughs is remarkably minimal. And I don't know how they've done it, because on the credits page there's a whole bunch of writers and story development members, so one would assume certain entries are written by different authors, but there's no credit for each individual story, and so as far as my reading experience, there's nothing that makes it feel like all these stories weren't written by one person, which makes for a smooth read. There are no obviously weaker writers undermining that with changes in quality or tone. Though, speaking of tone, that might be one area where the consistency actually becomes a bit of a double-edged sword, because the book has the incredibly difficult challenge of needing to create 52 distinct characterizations in a very limited word count. Some of them do come across as sounding maybe a little too similar in style and narration, but for the most part they've done a great job of achieving that, particularly without resorting to making any of them caricatures. The stories are written in a mix of either third or first person, though some are written in both. One potentially very important thing I noticed, but where my lack of knowledge about the games prevents me giving an accurate assessment, is that some of the information in the book, the background details regarding particular events, are completely different to those given in the flavor text on some of the cards or on the wiki. I noticed a couple while doing research, so I don't know what these discrepancies represent. Given how meticulous the rest of the book is, I highly doubt that this is a result of carelessness on the writer's or editor's behalf, but it's possible, I guess. More likely, I wonder if it's because as successive editions of the games have come out, if the lore has also been rewritten and changed as part of that. And so if that's the case, I don't know if the cards I saw, the wiki, or this book is out of date and no longer accurate, but I figured I'd better mention that there are these contradictions, as it could be relevant and important to players or readers of the novels. Also, I hope I've given you a clear enough understanding of exactly what kind of book this is, but just to be completely explicit so there's no misunderstanding, this is not a lore book in the sense of the sort of more encyclopedia-style lore books we sometimes see for certain games. There is lore in here, of course, but only as it's presented as part of the story. Neither is this any sort of truly immersive in-world book. Sometimes there are elements of that, stories told as character diaries or some other things we'll talk about later, but on the whole, it's not written or presented as a book that would actually exist in Arkham. One thing I think the book is sorely missing is a map of Arkham. I suspect the reason it wasn't included is because I think one of the games uses modular tiles, so maybe the layout of Arkham changes each game, but that's then kind of contradicted in the very first story in the book, where the character is basically giving a walking tour of Arkham that includes giving relative positions of certain locations. So I don't know, maybe players will disagree, but I think it would have benefited greatly from including a map of Arkham. At the back of the book there's an index, which is awesome, as that means you can quickly find characters, creatures, locations, and items that appear throughout. In theory, anyway, because, strangely, this index is the sole area of this book that shows any sign of being dumb and sloppy. In that, first of all, not every character is included, but for those that are, 99% of the time they're listed by their first name, which is not particularly helpful when, in the text, people are more often than not referred to by their title and surname. So frequently in the stories, you won't be given someone's first name, and therefore you can't really look them up conveniently, except for the 1% of the time where a character is listed by surname. Why? Who knows, but it gets even more ridiculous. For example, under P, it lists Dr. Phillips and Professor Young. That makes no sense. I feel like indexes have a pretty straightforward and well-established structure, so I don't even know how this can be an issue. On the very last page of the book, it tells you which artist did what work, which is much better than either A, having each artist's name printed on or below their artwork, which in this case would spoil the effect, or B, not crediting the artist of all. All of the art looks great, is wonderfully implemented and presented, and contributes immensely, having to reflect the mood and content of the stories, which I imagine severely limits curating what art can be shown while still having it make sense with the story being told. I'm not sure what percent of the artworks, if any, were created specifically for this book versus those that are just from the game cards or components, though I will say, just from looking up some of the cards, I noticed a lot of cases where the artworks in this book are not only much bigger, of course, but also not as cropped or altered as the art on the cards, so you often get to see the full original artwork, or at least closer to the original, because some do have minor alterations or obstructions. But this leads to my absolute favourite part of this book, the most special thing about it that really puts it in a league of its own, which I'm sure you've already noticed, and that is the extraordinary design throughout. Not just in terms of the layout and balancing of images to text, which is fantastic in terms of giving a great quantity of both, particularly when combined with the generous 260-page length of the book, makes it feel like there's a substantial amount of content. But even beyond that, every single story is given page decoration tailor-made to reflect that character and the theme of their story. The talent and effort and attention to detail on this front is outstanding, and it goes a long way to help give each character a unique identity, giving a unique feel to each story. Almost every spread contains some sort of visual accompaniment, mostly art, but even better than that is the occasional use of presenting some sort of in-world document or ephemera, diary pages, posters, telegrams, newspaper clippings, train tickets, a note scrawled on a napkin, etc. There's a really great variety. Nothing feels cookie cutter or repeated. It's all highly individualized, supports the story, looks good, and adds to the immersion. Even the less than a handful of spreads that don't include any art and such still use backgrounds or crumpled pages, and so still have a visual appeal. And I don't see this attention to design as being just bells and whistles or decoration. I think it's integral to why this book is so extraordinary. Obviously, great design is pointless if paired with bad writing. It can't make a bad story good, it can only make a good story better. So I mean, they could have just released these stories like a normal novel-sized anthology without any illustrations or design, but as good as they are, on their own, I don't think the stories would have been enough. They would have been nice background, but forgettable as a book, and certainly not as enjoyable and impressive as what we have here. It's that synergy that makes an unforgettable impression. So I don't really have any genuine criticisms, except for the index. As far as I can judge, this book is impeccable. However, I still think it's always a worthwhile thought experiment, at least to look at something that is 5 stars and ask, well, what would it take to be 6 stars? Is this the mountain's peak, or can we go even higher? Some people may deem that irrelevant or even reductive for a review like this, which is not untrue, but if you're willing to indulge my musings, the 2 areas that I would have liked to have been made even better are very simply just more of the 2 best aspects the book already has. Specifically, more interreferencing and links between the stories, as well as more of the immersive in-world documents. Both of these are the strongest and most delightful areas of the book, yet there is certainly more room for them to be pushed even further. The references and links are obviously important to any shared or expanded universe, but I think it's particularly important for the mythos because that was one of the major ideas present even prior to its actual foundation, with the admittedly very loose links between the King and Yellow stories. It's also a noteworthy part of what Fantasy Flight is trying to accomplish with their Arkham Horror Files products, but it's most important to this book, critically so. It's what makes it work. The idea of the references and connections unifying stories that otherwise are largely unsatisfying, isolated, and forgettable individually, yet can contribute to the larger experience of the book as a whole. And even though that is something the book book does, it would have benefited from more frequent links and or stronger links between the stories. The stories in the first 20% of this book seem to do a lot more of that and a better job of it. I don't know why that's the case, but it is. And even though plenty of the later stories still have great or interesting connections, it does drop off noticeably and becomes less of a defining feature, with some of the stories barely having one or two connections and are not as tied into the vast web. And I don't think it's a coincidence that those were also the stories I liked the least. Obviously, this is very hard to do when each story has such a limited word count, but as I keep saying, it's so crucial to the success because when they're not present, that's when the book's overall engagement and experience starts to wane. Or if there isn't enough room to include loads of interreferencing amongst trying to tell the story, then the one or two they do have room for need to be more significant, because it's not enough to just have one reference to Lovecraft or Arkham in a general way. They need more interreferencing between the stories themselves and give the book as a whole a worth and interest greater than the sum parts. I noticed cases where a throwaway character is invented for the sake of fulfilling a role in that one story when an existing character would have worked better instead, or where there was an obvious way to link certain characters, locations, events that could have dovetailed and been a little more tightly worked out and connected in more significant ways. Though you have to be careful with that too, otherwise the characters and world becomes too ingrown. In fact, mostly it was the tiniest, most subtle and inconsequential references and connections that were the most clever and delightful. So it doesn't have to be big stuff, it could even just be more of the links and references that reward you for paying attention and give richness and engagement through providing fun, little bits of evidence that these characters and stories coexist in the same world. Also, those are the things that show the people creating the book are astute and have invested thought, time and care into their work. As for the documents and ephemera, my desires are a little simpler, in that they're already so awesome and immersive that I just adore them and so simply want more, which I don't think is unreasonable, as there definitely is room for it. I think one per story would have been better and more satisfying, particularly in the cases where a document, a letter, a sketch, etc. is mentioned in the text and could have been shown visually. Not only is it more fun, engaging and nicer to look at, but it's also another area that is a well-established tradition in presenting and supporting mythos storytelling in games using immersive analog-style elements and design. Anyone who's played any of the mythos-related TTRPGs or purchased any products from the H.P. Lovecraft Historical Society or read the Arkham Horror Investigator novellas or plenty of other things will understand that and why it enhances those experiences. In fact, I keep going back and forth whether this book should have been presented completely in world and immersively, just through diaries, letters, newspapers and other documents. On the one hand, I feel like that might have been the ultimate realization of a book like this and provided more opportunity for more interesting narrative styles and presentation, which would have helped differentiate the characters, and being unfettered from the limited prosaic style would have allowed for more dense presentation of information. On the other hand, that's such a fundamental changing of the storytelling and experience that it might not be what the creators wanted. I don't know. I don't think one approach is intrinsically better than the other, it's just fun to think about. Regardless, these are all irrelevant musings, as the book already exists and is already phenomenal as is. From the way the project's been envisioned, to how every single area has been executed with 100% effort, intelligence and talent, meaning from top to bottom there is no weak link in this book. It displays true commitment to excellence, to arete that I'm always demanding on this channel, and that's why I wanted to showcase it, because it stands out as a truly special and impressive book. It also harkens back to a lament I've expressed in several other reviews of how disappointingly rare visual fiction books for an adult readership are, distinct from comics of course. There's so much unrealized potential there, and so many applications for visually entertaining and engaging storytelling and world building, and I think this book provides a great case and model for that. Really, we usually only see this sort of thing if a video game gets a lore book or something, but like I mentioned earlier, they are often more encyclopedic or textbooky in nature. Ditto TTRPGs and war games that have beautiful fiction and art produced for them, but are always hidden inside of rulebooks and not really feasible or substantial enough to warrant acquiring the whole rulebook. On that note though, another book you may be interested in, especially if you are a fan of the Arkham Horror game, is the Arkham Horror 3rd Edition Deluxe Rulebook. It's about 90 pages and half the book is a reprint of the rulebook, but the other half is kind of a companion to the Investigators of Arkham book. 30 pages are about specific locations in Arkham, which sounds pretty cool, as I imagine it helps color and reinforce the idea of this shared world to be able to get more information about the locations mentioned in the stories. But the book also includes 2 additional investigator profiles in the same style we've seen in today's book. Obviously there's that frustration that I just talked about where you have to buy a whole rulebook just to get the 40 pages of fiction, but I think it's uncommonly respectful for a company to go this route rather than doing an updated edition edition of the Investigators book with the 2 new profiles included in an attempt to coerce fans to buy the whole book a second time in order to have the complete experience. Also, for the Investigators of Arkham Horror, there was a pre-order premium edition. It's the exact same book, it just comes with some other crappy items. But that includes 3 cards for the game. I have no idea if they were exclusive or special cards in any way, but I thought it best to mention for any card collectors, just in case. In 2006, there was a book called The Art of H.P. Lovecraft's Cthulhu Mythos, which contains art from the Call of Cthulhu CCG and RPG. That book has some really awesome art, but with some really awful layout, mostly in the form of giant white blank spaces taking up so much of the book. But for a book with excellent art and excellent layout, there is last year's The Art of Arkham Horror, which is exactly what it sounds like, an art book showcasing the full art created for some of the cards and such. There's a lot of overlap between the pieces included in the art book and the Investigators book, but also tons of artworks not included in the Investigators book, and I like the art in it much better because it has more of the cool and exciting pieces. Though, on the other hand, I'm pretty sure there are artworks in the Investigators book that aren't in the art book. Whatever the case, both The Art of Arkham Horror and especially the Investigators of Arkham Horror are absolutely exemplary books, highly recommended to both fans of the Arkham Horror files and for fans of the Cthulhu mythos in general.